So Boker Tov, everyone. Welcome. Delighted to be studying with you once again today. I'll just let you know that we have a few more sessions left. We're going to take a little break beginning in June. So our last session will actually be on May the 27th, but there won't be one on May the 20th. So we've got a few left after today. Anyway, lots of stuff that we can cover between now and then. So today we're looking at Parshat Emor. And a couple of verses struck me as particularly interesting. And a word that comes up fascinatingly more times in this week's Parsha than in last week's Parsha, which is entitled, as you recall, Kedoshim. So the word Kadosh, holy, comes up more in this week's Parsha than last week. And as you probably know, we begin the Parsha talking about the priests and various restrictions as to whom they can marry, and of course different activities that they need to perform, and the fact that they need to preserve themselves in a state of holiness and not be contaminated or become impure, lo yitama, not defile themselves. All sorts of fascinating English translations of the word tameh. We won't deal with that to any great extent. I will just ask, I hear my voice in somebody's computer, so maybe just careful with the volume. There we go. Okay.
Mike.
So I wanted to start with one verse that I found particularly. Actually, before I start with a verse, I'm going to ask you a question. And I know we discussed this a little bit last year, probably this time of year as well, or on another occasion. I want to ask you, and perhaps best either put it in the chat box or you just unmute yourselves and share your thoughts. How does holiness occur? What determines holiness? Give yourself a moment to think about that. And my question sounds incredibly vague, and that's intentional. So try to think of what determines holiness and how does holiness occur? So anyone who'd like to unmute and share a thought or to put it in the chat box, feel free. I'll give you a minute or two, don't worry. And as perhaps a little bit of encouragement, tell me the last time you felt personally holy or in a holy environment. Dr. Kraft, you've unmuted yourself. Oh, no? Okay. It gives us a feeling of awe and respect, makes us feel closer to God. Okay. Separateness. So that's a wonderful criterion, because we read, especially in previous parshiot in Vayikra, which deals, of course, with laws and the code of holiness, it talks about lehavdil, ben hatamei latahor, between the pure and the impure. This idea of separating ourselves and separating things we eat, separating our behavior, and mostly separating ourselves, being a nation apart is often the way we describe it. And from Kodesh to Chol. Of course, in Havdalah, we have that very powerful connection of separating the holy from the profane. When I was at the Kotel and Rachel's Chaver. Rachel's Kever, you mean?
Yeah. I
spelled
spelled it wrong.
Kever.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Okay, so continue to think about that a little bit. I want to add a couple of elements. So I left it intentionally vague because you've both, or all of you who've shared ideas, have touched on two different types of parameters for holiness. So certainly one is location. Ruth mentioned two places, two locations where she, and you can correct me if I'm not using the right terms, Ruth, experienced or felt something that might be defined as holiness, as Kedusha. And Stephen mentioned this idea of holiness as separating between experiences of time and environment, because Kodesh Chol, we're talking about separation between Shabbat, distinction between Shabbat and the weekday. That is a holiness that is connected more to time as opposed to location. So there are different ways of viewing holiness. And I don't know what the majority of people feel, but I think many people associate, regardless of the statistics, many people associate holiness with a place. They go somewhere to be moved by something unique about that place, something which in Stephen's terms separates that place from other places, because inherently there may be something unique and special and separate and holy about it, or of course, because some event has taken place there that we would associate with and attribute holiness to. And of course, the kotel is a very powerful one. The stones themselves, we often think of holiness as a holy site, but what does a holy site mean? Is the material, is the tangible element that's present there, is that holy? Are those stones holy? Again, it's not for us to decide, but if you keep in mind that the kotel, those stones are simply an engineering element to support the Temple Mount. The stones themselves had no purpose that might be directly associated with holiness, other than providing support for an incredibly important platform on which the entire basis of Jewish identity and Israelite identity earlier on was expressed through sacrifice. And of course, we talk about holy acts, the people who perform those sacrifices, who run the temple business and ritual. I don't hesitate to use that word, not in so much the present negative connotation, but in the sense that there was a business there that needed to be run efficiently, people bringing sacrifices, purchasing things, and cleaning up and everything, a very, very complicated procedure to make sure that things ran smoothly. So the idea that people who were considered needed to separate themselves from the rest of the nation and perform acts where they had to maintain a certain holiness, a separateness. The acts themselves, the sacrifices were considered something that elicited a sense of holiness. So you might say that anything associated with that, including supporting stones, those big, huge stones that make up the kotel and a much larger extent of underground wall, of course, those perhaps have an element of holiness to them as well. But there are also other types of holiness in terms of location. We can talk about our attribution of holiness to holy sites because an event took place there. And as Stephen says, it's the closest place we can get to the temple platform itself without stepping onto it, whether for political or religious reasons. But holiness might be inherent in something, not necessarily because something occurred there. In our tradition, and reflective of what was prevalent in ancient religious civilization, high places were considered holy, not because anything happened there, but because perhaps in I guess I shouldn't hesitate to say a rather primitive view, it allowed us to be closer to God in the heavens. This idea that the higher up we are physically, maybe that is an element of elevated spirituality as well, but certainly being able to be in greater proximity to God. So it's no coincidence that the high places were considered holy, and therefore sacrifice took place there, even in Israelite tradition. I would say even the idea that the bamot, the high places, continue to be holy and used by many, even when the temple was built. That the prophets complain, everyone complains about the fact, Rak habamot lo saro. No matter what any reform somebody tried to do, those high places remain. People insisted on going there for their holy spiritual experience with God, either out of convenience or because they simply felt something there based on the tradition of civilizations that existed before them, and this ancient idea that the higher up you are, the more opportunities you have to perhaps engage, interact with God. Some people consider trees holy. There are different civilizations that consider them holy. Indigenous people consider places holy, perhaps because various spirits have inhabited those places and continue to inhabit those places. Again, there may be some historical, religious, spiritual connection with those places. So this idea that location allows us to feel a sense of holiness, something that separates that place from other places and makes it something special. But there is a holiness that is inherent in something other than location as well. And for that, I turn to a verse in this week's Parsha, which is a beautiful verse. And again, if one is familiar with the narrative and various texts in the Torah, it will resonate and connect with other elements that tie in with this verse just by virtue of the words. So if you want, you just listen, you don't have to really look to the Chumash, but I'm in Parashat Emor, of course, chapter 22, verse 32. V'lo techalalu et shem kodshi, v'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael, ani Adonai mekadishchem. So what does it say? And this is just before we get into a description of all the various festivals which we celebrate, everything we mark biblically in the Hebrew calendar, beginning, of course, we're talking about Shabbat and going on to the various festivals. By the way, without looking, and what would be the first occasion in the calendar that we would mention after Shabbat? Yeah, don't look. Just give me an idea. What should be the first in the calendar that we mention? It's kind of like a little quiz question. Pesach, excellent. Because Chodesh Harishon is Nisan, the month of Exodus from Egypt. So we begin with Pesach, not with Rosh Hashanah. All right, that's aside. So this idea that before we begin to talk about holiness in terms of what? In terms of time. Festivals, holy days in the unique Hebrew calendar that we gave great emphasis to back in the Parshat Bo, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodeshim Rishon Hu Lachem Lechodshei Hashana. This idea of the development of the Hebrew calendar, again, another element that separates us, that makes us kadosh, because we have our own calendar, our own special calendar. That separates us from the other nations, from other religious traditions, initially from the Egyptian cultural and religious tradition and ritual in which we were immersed as slave for however many hundreds of years. So this element of time and celebration of a separate calendar is something that allows us to feel holiness that's unique to us. But more than that, before it begins that, it says, "You shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people. I, the Lord, who sanctify you. I brought you out of the land of Egypt." So that historical connection as well. So what are they saying here? We've talked about location, talked about holy places, and the essence that we often attribute to a space as being holy for various reasons that we just discussed. Then we mentioned the fact that we have a calendar that allows us to feel holy, separate, unique, because we celebrate occasions at our own time, what makes sense for us as a unique people. But here, the text is offering something else. Besides time and place, and perhaps drawing the two together, it's saying, V'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael. When do I become sanctified or holy? Because we read earlier, we have this idea that ki kadosh ani, kadoshim to you, you shall be holy. If we go back to last week's Parsha, you shall be holy because I am holy, meaning my essence as God, I'm holy. I don't need to do anything. I don't need to be anywhere to be holy. That is the essence of God, holiness. And yet, what's it saying here? V'nikdashti, meaning maybe I'm only considered holy under certain circumstances. What are those circumstances? Betoch b'nei Yisrael, in the midst of the Israelite people. An incredibly beautiful, powerful, engaging statement, bringing the divine together with the human element. Because what is sanctification? Sanctification is when there is a community to sanctify. And it's no coincidence that somebody by the name of Rav Ada bar Ahava asks this question: how do we know that the individual Jew is not to recite the Kedusha on his own, And I'll come back to that in a moment, because the Torah stresses that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people, meaning you can only achieve the element of kedusha, of holiness, in community. You can't be holy on your own, or at least let me rephrase that to be a little more inclusive. You can't achieve the true essence and the greatest measure of holiness unless you do it and attempt to do that in the presence of community. Judaism has never, ever encouraged hermits. It has never encouraged living on your own in the desert, trying to engage and interact with God. It doesn't condemn it, but it doesn't look at it as something that is the preferred derech, the preferred route, path to lead to some kind of communion with the holy, with God. In order to truly experience it, you need to do it in community. V'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael. And therefore, Kedusha, the part we say, off in the second page of the Amidah, which is said together with community, led by the Baal Tfilah, Balat Tfilah, whoever is leading it, we only do in community, in a minyan. I'll come back to that in a moment. But that element, as well as Kaddish, so from the same root, this idea of holiness, those two very powerful elements in our tradition, liturgical elements, can only be done, can only be performed when we have community, as defined by a minyan. And I won't go into the great details of how they go about it, but I should just say that when we talk about how we understand what is a community, I would ask you that question first, and then we'll get to the halachic technical definition. So let me ask you now, I'm putting such stress on the need and essence of community in order to achieve holiness, at least according to the context of this verse. How would you define community? What is the essence of community? When does community occur? I'm using those same questions that I asked you before about holiness. So give that a shot. How does community occur? And what determines community? Go ahead, Ruth.
A group of people who share common goals or values.
Okay. I see that in the chat box, group of people with common purpose or identity. Great. Anyone else? Gathering together who also give comfort. So that's how sorry, Lynn, go ahead. I see you unmuted yourself.
I was just going to say, community was getting together after the minyan in the morning and having breakfast with a group of people of like mind.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so we all have our sense of people of like mind, people who want to be together for whatever purpose. You might say community can also be a group of people brought together, not necessarily of their own initiative. That can happen as well. And in order for it to become a true community, really, that might be called a gathering. In order for it to become community, then you have to find something that those people share and want to remain together. So, we can play semantics here, but I would say that there's a difference between a gathering, and again, these are not official English dictionary definitions, but just a way of trying to describe something. We can talk about a gathering of people, a group of people, and then we can talk about a community of people. Perhaps a community is something that needs to be developed. It's not something that all of a sudden forms out of the ether and forms because people happen to group around something. But you can either have people who come together because they've arranged to come together in community, or people who gather for whatever reason, but are able to form a sense of community That may include all those who are gathered or may not. You may be in a gathering, but some people in that gathering may have formed a community, even though others remain only in the form of a gathering. But again, we won't play too much with the semantics of that. But I would agree with you that in order for there to be a sense, understanding, and appreciation for community, there needs to be something that people share together and that people want, and that people want to be together to achieve or to experience. At the same time, and this takes us back to our Torah connection, we read about gatherings are defined as an Eidah. An Eidah is often a word used in the Bible for a community, but sometimes Eidah can be used in a negative context. So when we talk about people getting together for a common purpose or identity, we look at, and this is where our understanding perhaps of Minyan comes from, the 10 spies. Those 10 spies got together for a common purpose. That purpose was to deceive the Israelites into thinking that there isn't a chance in a million that we could conquer the Holy Land. So that's a common purpose. That's an identity. That's an experience they shared. They all went to the Holy Land as spies. And their common purpose was what we would see today as something quite negative, not something that brought any great benefit to the greater community of which they supposedly belonged. So people sharing a common purpose or identity, you might want to call that a bad community, or you might want to continue to call it a community, and community may not be something that is inherently good. Of course, our understanding, I would dare to say that when we talk about community, sharing common purpose or identity should be seen as something as positive, a common purpose for the general good of all those within the community. You might say that the spies thought what they were doing was for the benefit of the community. We can't go there. If we want to save ourselves, let's go back to Egypt. Things were better there. This is wrong. We've made it wrong. We got to admit and acknowledge that this is the wrong path. Let's go back to Egypt. So you might say that they thought they had the interests of the community in mind. And it's hard for us to accept that, because when we look at the incident of the spies in Parashat Shlach Lecha, everything seems so negative. It seems it's clearly they're to blame. It seems clearly that they chose the wrong path. But who are we to decide whether their purpose was intended for the benefit or for, we seem to see them as bad people. They're punished. And sometimes our definition of community may be different from the definition of others who define themselves as a community. You might call, and we wouldn't perhaps use the word community or in a different context, you might call a cult a community as well. And certainly they consider themselves a community. Is a cult, and there are many examples, I don't have to cite them, and many, I don't hesitate to say bad examples, suicidal cults, destructive cults. Are those communities? Sure. They see themselves as a community who are gathering together for the benefit of their group, of their community. They're not seeking perhaps to make the world a better place necessarily. Perhaps they see the world as a bad and evil place, and therefore they have separated themselves to make themselves holy in their eyes as a community that seeks to live a life that's worthwhile, unlike the life of the vast majority of people who've sought the wrong path. So when we understand community, there may be communities out there that we don't agree with, who have values that we don't share, but they share a value and they see themselves as community. And those cults are some of the most tightly knit, powerful communities that have ever existed. Whether you call it brainwashing, whether you call it deceitful, doesn't matter. That community is incredibly tight. And I would say as well, when we talk about a community, we talk about communities within the greater Jewish people. There are many communities within the Jewish people that see themselves as communities. And without, as they say, lahavdil, to separate, not to compare directly, but to be willing to compare, look at very strict ultra-Orthodox communities among the Jewish people. They also have a very powerful sense of community. They feel themselves as they are observing, expressing Judaism as it should be preserved, maintained, sustained, and kept viable, as opposed to the expressions out there outside of their community. So they have very, very powerful community ties, and that sense of separateness that we talked about before, even separateness within the Jewish people, but that is their community. Whether we agree with it or not, it's not a question. They don't care that we don't agree. And maybe we have to acknowledge that if that's the type of community, if that's the nature and essence of community that they seek to develop and maintain among themselves, so be it. That's their choice. You might say, well, they don't allow a whole lot of freedom of thought and expression and movement and behavior within their community. Those are our values. We can't say that their community should be based on our values. They've chosen to express themselves, live their lives, and identify in a certain way. That is their sense and essence of community. It shouldn't be for us to decide how they express themselves or live their lives, just as we don't want them to impose on our understanding and expression of Judaism either. And if we go to the state of Israel and try to understand who is able, who seeks to impose their understanding of Judaism, whether very traditional or inclusive and liberal, on others, don't think it's only a one-sided path. Don't think it's a one-way street. There are efforts by different expressions of Judaism to impose or to encourage communities with whom they don't identify to perhaps to be more open and accept their values. So it's not such a simple question of certainly in Israel and elsewhere. Let's get back to this idea of the sense of community. So Stephen mentioned also this idea when we talk about the Mishkan. It says, God, v'shachanti b'tocham, I shall dwell among you. Why does God need to dwell among us? Is it for God or is it for us? Is it so we feel, if God is in our presence, we feel that kedusha, that separateness from other nations because God is with us and we can feel holy? Or, interestingly, in the verse in this week's Parashah, v'nikdashti, so God can feel, if I can use that anthropomorphic term, so God can feel sanctified in our midst. Who's it for? I think the Torah gives us different understandings of how we view holiness. We, as I mentioned before, said God, ki kadosh ani. God is holy. God's essence is holy, but maybe not. God perhaps needs us to be properly sanctified just as much as we need God's presence among us in order for us to feel that kedusha, that separateness, that holiness. And perhaps, again, there are other communities out there. It's not for us to claim that having God among us allows us to feel holy, but it doesn't preclude the possibility that God is among other communities and allows them to feel holy and separate in their own way. And I think that's perhaps the idea. It doesn't say here that God is not among anyone else. It says that God seeks to live among us, v'shachanti b'tocham, but it doesn't say that v'shachanti b'tocham v'lo b'toch af echad acher. It doesn't say God doesn't seek to dwell among other communities. Yes, there is harsh criticism of the idolatry and the abhorrent habits and behavior of other peoples in terms of how they deal with one another. But it doesn't mean that God doesn't seek to dwell among them and allow them to feel their sense of community and perhaps a greater understanding of what and who and how God is in order for them to live their lives in a better way. Obviously, there's very harsh criticism of other religious civilization in biblical times. But this idea of mutuality is one that we shouldn't shy away from. It takes us back to that silly expression. If a tree falls in the forest, does it make any sound if there's nobody there to hear it? So if God is around, can God possibly be holy if there's no community to experience God? So perhaps that's what it's saying here. There's no value or validation of God's holiness unless it can be sanctified within a community. And maybe that's why we only allow ourselves to do Kedusha and Kaddish when we're with community. And during these times of COVID, with Zoom and all the technology we have, there's been so much discussion about when can we say Kaddish? And that's, that people's, I'd say that's the most frequent question we've had these days is, can I say Kaddish in Zoom? Is it okay? On live stream, is it okay? What if I can't be in a community? What do I do if I'm traveling? I'm isolated. My computer doesn't work. I can't connect to a minyan. That doesn't mean, especially, what if I'm on Shiva and I can't say Kaddish? So because we want to understand and encourage sense of community, we often are very clear about people not saying Kaddish. At least we were until March of 2020. People ask me all the time, well, can I say Kaddish if I'm on my own? And I'd, in as kind and understanding way as possible, I would try to say to them, well, next time you're in a minyan, say the Kaddish. If you miss a yurtzeit, it doesn't mean you can't say Kaddish. It doesn't mean you miss that one day and you can't say Kaddish the next day. What did we just celebrate? Oh, I don't know to what extent you celebrated. And I'll be honest, I didn't either. But on Monday, we had something called Pesach Sheni. What is Pesach Sheni? An opportunity for those who, for whatever circumstances, travel, impurity, were not allowed to bring the Pesach Korban, the Pesach sacrifice, in the month of Nisan. So they're given a second chance in ER. This past Monday, that was your opportunity. So Judaism allows that, and that's as clear an indication of anything. If for whatever reason you weren't able to say Kaddish on the day of a yurtzeit, then do it the next time. But it brings us back to the question, what about in Shiva? I need to say Kaddish. I'm not going to be in Shiva next week. It doesn't work that way. I'm observing Shiva for these 7 days or whatever shortened period, depending on certain circumstances. What if I can't say Kaddish? What if something happens and I can't connect to community, especially in days of COVID? So I don't hesitate to say that I'm absolutely delighted that Rabbi Shaim saw fit for the live stream service on Shabbat, which is not defined as a minyan. And you might say, well, that's a contradiction. We don't say Kedusha, we don't do the repetition of the Amidah on Shabbat because we don't have a minyan. Live stream, because there's no interaction, we don't see other people who are part of that virtual community as we do on Zoom. So it can't be considered a minyan. It's only the three of us there, Rabbi Shaim, Cantor Loomer, and Michael Rubin, or ritual director Michael Rubin, whatever you want, or Rabbi Walker, Cantor Loomer, and Michael Rubin. There are only three of us. There's no minyan there. So no repetition, no kedusha. But I think with great wisdom and sensitivity, Rabbi Shaim agreed to do a mourner's Kaddish at the beginning of the service and at the end of the service, because we want to encourage people to understand and appreciate the essence of community, but it's just impossible under the circumstances to do that. So why should we deny ourselves that sense of community because circumstances are denying it? So we're saying no. We're saying COVID notwithstanding, pandemic notwithstanding, war notwithstanding. Believe me, this isn't the first time that Jews haven't been able to gather in community to say Kaddish. So all those things notwithstanding, we need to find a way to allow people to continue to appreciate the community, even if they can't experience it at that moment. And so the decision was made to say that Kaddish, although not Kedusha. Kedusha, Kaddish is something that's much more powerful for people. Kedusha is something that's said in the Amidah that has certain liturgical significance. But Kaddish has an incredibly emotional, psychological, and answers powerful emotional, psychological needs for people who are either observing Yurtzeit or saying Kaddish, and particularly for those who are in Shiva or saying the Kaddish during the 11 months. If we deny them that opportunity, despite the halachic understandings of being in minyan and community, we're affecting, for the worse, their mental health. And health and life have always taken precedence in Jewish tradition. There's no question, with the exception of 3 circumstances, where we need to preserve life, and even if it means transgressing some element of halacha. And if you think about it, mental health and emotional well-being are no less important than anything physical or physiological. And we need to make sure that in these days of COVID, of Zoom, and whatever other technology we're using, we have to continue to maintain that sense of community. And I don't know if you feel that the Zoom community is a holy one, is a separate one, is one that allows you to feel a certain distinctness from your everyday activities. But I'll be honest, I feel that way. I remember at the beginning, I was saying Zoom, I'm seeing a bunch of people on a screen, a grid screen. It's great to see all those faces, people drinking their coffee, eating a croissant, reading a book, falling asleep. I mean, and all those things happen, and that's fine. But the fact that people want to be there and share a common purpose, I would say that at this point, there's almost nobody who comes to a Zoom service that doesn't want to be there. I'd say at the beginning, there were a lot of people who didn't want to be here, who didn't see it as anything of value, but that was the only thing that was available. And still, it's the only thing available, but it's something, as you suggested, that people are choosing to do. They don't need to be there. Perhaps those who need to say Kaddish, there may still be that element, but I know the people who've been coming to Zoom, whether it's at Beth David or the thousands of other Zoom minyanim that are taking place around the Jewish world, and perhaps in other faith communities as well, they're there because they've learned, if they were initially a gathering of people, they've learned to establish community in that Zoom presence. It's something they've now chosen. It's something in which they find a common purpose and identity. And I would dare to say that what we do here not only makes us feel holy, but when God, in God's omniscience and awareness of everything that's going on, that has gone on, and that will go on, depending on your theological views, I can only imagine God laughing now. I knew back then at Sinai, at some point in the future, people will be looking on a screen and thinking of me being among them. And yeah, you know what? I'm among them at that Zoom minyan. V'nikdashti. I feel sanctified in that minyan on Zoom. It makes me feel good that these people are going to the trouble of getting together for common purpose, to share experience, whether it be mourning, grief, or joy. And that's where I feel sanctified. Of course, don't tell God I paraphrased him at all, but I can imagine a smile in the most anthropomorphically expressed terms, God smiling up there, looking at these Zoom minyanim and Zoom sessions and thinking, I got the right people after all. One last thing I want to share with you is that this idea, when I say the right people, I'm not just talking about the Jews, of course, right people being, as opposed to Neanderthals and Australopithecines, humanity. One last thing I want to share with you, and it kind of ties in with this. We read it a couple of times when we talk about Moed, the times, the occasions of the festivals and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, etc. There's a wonderful phrase right at the beginning that's repeated a couple times. It says this: "V'daber Adonai al Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Israel v'amarta lehem moadei Adonai asher tikru otam mikra'ei kodesh elehem moadai." The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, these are my fixed times." And this is where I don't like the translation: "the fixed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as sacred occasions." So it uses the same phrase, Moadei Adonai, Mikra'ei Kodesh. One is fixed times and one is sacred occasions. But they both refer to times. They both refer to a gathering that takes place at a certain time. But there's another way to look at Mikra'ei. What is Mikra'ei? Likro, to call someone. So Mikra'ei Kodesh are really, and it's translated interestingly in the JPS from an older version, it calls them holy convocations. What's a holy convocation? Anyone who's graduated from some kind of academic institution, convocation is a gathering together of all the graduates for that year or whatever who celebrate their shared accomplishment over the past year or number of years, having gotten through their studies and are gathering together to celebrate that event. It's as much a location as it is a time for celebration, as it is, and perhaps the most important, the convocation, the gathering together. People who have shared an experience, people who identify with something together, but it's the gathering together. And when we talk about festivals, that's the essence here. We've been talking about community the whole time, and this idea of gathering together, whether in a specific location or at a specific time, but it's the coming together during those festivals that is the essence of the festival. Yes, you can eat matzah by yourself on Pesach, and unfortunately, many people experienced that the last couple Pesachim. They ate matzah and ate maror and tried to celebrate a Seder on their own or with a partner or with a small family, whatever. But gathering together for these occasions is the essence of the festival. The festival is to be together with others, to be in community. And that's why on the 3 festivals, that's when people came to Jerusalem. Everybody was there, yes, to bring their sacrifices, but more importantly, to be together as a people, as a large community, to celebrate a shared history, shared traditions, shared rituals, but to be together to do that. If you want to understand the essence of our calendar, you need to do it in community. So celebrating the festivals, as we're forced to do nowadays, more in isolation and less with community, is something that's due to circumstances. But if you really want to appreciate the sense of those festivals and of our calendar, you need to do it in community. However you define that community. You may say community is in shul. I'm not saying it's in the shul. Community can be in many different ways, but gathering together for those festivals is a beautiful experience. The kibbutzim, the more secular-oriented kibbutzim in Israel, gathered together and celebrated festivals in a very culturally, not religiously oriented way, based on some of the things we read in the agriculture celebrations in Parashat Emor. That was their convocation of members of the kibbutz. They went on a wagon ride in the fields to understand and appreciate the value and the gift and the blessing of successful agricultural produce. They didn't go to shul. They couldn't care less about shul. They didn't bring out the liturgy from the Siddur. That wasn't part of their gathering. But the idea of gathering together to celebrate something in their understanding of that celebration was the essence, being in community. And so what I would wish us all is that when we try to understand and appreciate and value any of our tradition, it is best done in community. Whatever size that community is, whatever the exact common purpose or goal or identification of that community is, but it's done in community. Study, celebration, grief, mourning, and again, these things have all been denied us in the last year. And perhaps coming out of this, emerging from this plague, this endemic in the coming months, as we will surely do. As grim as things may look right now, I'm not being a prophet in saying that we're going to emerge from this, because that's the nature of our humanity, and we're going to succeed in finding a way to deal with this and getting out of this situation at some point. And when we emerge, I'm hoping that people will have a better understanding and appreciation of community, of getting together, community being one that helps others. Because when we talk about community, that common purpose has to be for the betterment of the community. And I think in our case, the betterment of everyone. It's not just for a small group of people separating themselves from everyone else. No, it's for a community that perhaps works best, even in a small group, but sees the betterment and the benefits and the good of everyone at heart. So whether that's social action issues and working as a community to do that, there are many different ways to express that, but that has to be our goal. And again, it's my hope, and I'm not alone in that when we do come out of this, people will understand how important community is, and thinking of those, especially those who've suffered from lack of community, from isolation, whether it be the elderly, the sick, the homeless, and many others. We have to remember that community is something that everyone should have access to. And it shouldn't be just something that we enjoy, but we need to allow people to access community in many different ways. That's my wish for us, and I hope that we all are able to work towards that in the coming weeks and months. I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments. Oh, come on, somebody must have something to say.
Okay, I'll say something. Michael, Ruth and I get together at 12 o'clock every day for Women's League, and we have what we call, and they call, a holy community, because we do Mishabera, and we do Psalm, or we do something so that we're able to do Kaddish, which is very comforting to a lot of people who need to say it. And so it's become what we call a holy community, and the people who run it call it a holy community. Ruth, help me out.
Makom Kadosh?
Makom B'Yachad.
Yeah.
A place together. Beautiful, yeah. Beautiful idea. I love the name as well.
There's an expression, comfort in numbers, and I think we're seeing how positive that is and how necessary it is for us.
A fascinating session, really interesting. There's a PhD thesis in there for someone in the future about what's better for community, live stream, Zoom, or whatever. I enjoyed this session very much. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.
Well, I thank everybody for joining this morning, and I wish you the energy and the motivation and the sense of urgency to continue to work towards gathering people together and fomenting and developing a sense of community among those people.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
I'll just mention that the next few sessions are going to be actually evening sessions. So the next 2 weeks, the sessions will take place at I think at 8 p.m. as opposed to the morning, because we have some B'nai Mitzvah celebrations taking place. So but you'll see on the website in any case.
Okay.
Have a great day, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you
For every time.
Yes.
They're great.
Bye, everybody.